Good evening, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. I've got a really interesting and important guest for us tonight, Dennis Mills, who is a former member of Parliament, former businessman with Magna and numerous other companies, including Racing Future Inc., CGX Energy, Pacific Rublus Energy, MI Developments, etc., and an amazing guy and someone who wants to talk about collaboration and cooperation, particularly today relative to where he thinks we were 20 years ago. Dennis Mills, welcome to the show, sir.
Brian, it's always a pleasure to see you. It's great.
So tell me, what is it that you think we're missing today in cooperation and collaboration, and why is this relevant to something that happened 20 years ago?
We celebrate today the 20th anniversary of the most vivid example of governments collaborating in the history of our country. It was when Toronto was under a World Health Organization watch, and we decided that we wanted to send a signal to the whole world that we were back in business. And Michael Cole, God bless Michael Cole, the manager of the Rolling Stones, agreed to work with the boys, and they found a time, the last day in July, to bring the boys here with a number of other groups. And the city of Toronto, the province of Ontario, the government of Canada, all the police forces gathered, and we put on an event that put together at Park Downsview 500,000 people. And we had the BBC there, we had the CNN there, we had the China News there. And I'll tell you why I think this collaboration is relevant today, in today's era, because I think that the issues of the housing crisis we have, the poverty that we have, the drugs in the city of Toronto, all of these issues are of the same intensity and the same magnitude or more than when we were under that SARS period. And I like to think that the model of collaboration that we had 20 years ago is something that should be revisited and meditated on, because I personally didn't like the message that the government of Canada, and I am a Liberal, but the message that the government of Canada gave to our newly elected mayor, Chow, 5 days ago, that we, the government of Canada, are not going to be there for Toronto. I think that's the wrong sort of spirit. What we did 20 years ago, Brian, we had a period of 10 weeks where we were all selfless. It was a 10 weeks of selflessness. We were servants. We were servants for the people. We were servants for the country. And when Mad Cow was developed 4 weeks into our project, we decided to do a mile-long barbecue, and all the Western premiers came in, and we made that happen. And what I believe, Brian, is lacking today is this spirit of selflessness and getting to solve the problem rather than all of this small, petty bickering. SARS, Molson's Canadian Rocks never would have happened had the spirit that we're working in today was back then. Then we collaborated for the greater good.
Remind us all what happened with SARS and how this event came to unfold.
Well, what had happened was when the World Health Organization, WHO, put Toronto on a watch, it told people do not visit Toronto, which is essentially do not visit Canada. And what happened, our bars were empty, our restaurants, our hotels, everything was frozen. Our tourism sector, the greatest employer of any sector of our economy, heading into spring, summer, collapsed. It was a total collapse. And what happened, I was involved, part of the Toronto caucus. They asked me to go to Toronto to work with some businessmen to see what could we do. The problem was, at that time, the meetings were great, the people were great, but it was all for a year. It was all for a year out. I had 100 restaurants on the Danforth. They wouldn't have survived September. never mind waiting a year. And so that's when I went to Michael Cole, the manager of the Rolling Stones. And Michael Cole said, I like the idea. The Stones have global reach. And he then confirmed the following day that they would participate. Quite frankly, what happened, I put out a copy of the confirmation that he gave me by fax that they would participate. I put that out through Mike Duffy, CTV, and for 2 days, Brian, I was literally shunned. I was an idiot. How could we dare give taxpayers money to the Rolling Stones? People were missing the point. We have 250,000 businesses that are on the verge of collapse. We've got to think outside the box. So I was on a CFRB show the following day, and one of the callers said, get the private sector to pay for the artists, and the government should just do things like the security and the washrooms, etc. And that became the pathway to us getting the job done. And the following day, I ran into Dan O'Neill, the late Dan O'Neill now, who is the president of Molson Breweries. And I'll never forget, he walked up to me in a pub on King Street. It was called the Peel Pub. And he said, I am not giving you, Dennis, $10 million. And I said, Dan, we only need 5. 5 for the artists. If you look after that, the government of Canada will look after the rest. And to make the long story short, when Dan O'Neill committed the following day, and Julian Fantino, the police chief, committed to look after the security, on we went. But the genius of Michael Cole in putting the show together is a story in itself. But the message that I would really like to get through on your show today is this spirit of selflessness, this spirit of being a servant to the whole community and putting aside your political differences. I remember when Jack Layton came up the day of the event, and he said to me, Jack, and he was my political opponent, the head of the NDP, Dennis, can you find me a place that I can work? Jack, take my office. There it is. I have a trailer over there. There's phones. Do what you want. We were all collaborating. I remember going to Ernie Eves, the then premier of the province, and said, Ernie, our budget, we're $2 million short. Can you help us? An hour later, Tony Clement was on the site at Downsview, and Ron Barbaro was there from the head of OLG. And they said, we like what you're doing. This is the right thing for the community and the country. We're in for the $2 million. And I guess what bothers me, Brian, is today it's not how we can collaborate and work together. It's how we divide ourselves. And I think that's really not what public service and being a servant is all about.
500,000 people came?
Over 500,000 people came. We never had a death, and everybody went home healthy.
And broadcast about it around the world?
More importantly, all of that was great, but the greatest thing was that we sent the message to the world that Canada was back in business.
What a great event. Thank you for organizing it.
Well, we thank Michael Cole, Dan O'Neill, the list goes on, all the people in all the various levels of government. The TTC were geniuses. You know, but today, Brian, we've got all these other issues. You got to use the same principle of collaboration and cooperation.
I agree. Let's take a break for some messages and come back in just 2 minutes with Dennis Mills, former member of parliament, former senior business executive with numerous different companies, and a really smart, capable guy, and talk a little bit more about what's going wrong now with cooperation and collaboration and how we get this attitude from 20 years back again. Stay with us, everyone. Back in 2.
Ready.
Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. My guest tonight is Dennis Mills. Dennis, you spent, what was it, a decade and a half as a member of parliament?
20 years on Parliament Hill, 16 of them elected.
And
I live my life.
And then also quite a long time with with Chairman Mills, with Magna, with numerous different business organizations as well, correct?
Well, my family business, my grandfather started Chairman Mills 110 years ago with a horse and a wagon. And, as I grew older, it was part of the family experience that you get involved with the business. And the greatest lesson that I ever learned from my experience working with my father at Chairman Mills happened when I was 13 years old. And we were doing a pickup from a party in Forest Hill on a Sunday morning. And after we loaded the chairs and the tables on the back of the truck, the lady yelled out, Mills, come and take out my garbage, take out my garbage. And so my father responded by going up and taking the three sort of galvanized cans of garbage and taking them out to the roadway. And when we got back into the truck, I said to my dad, I said, Dad, I don't think we really needed to take out our garbage. That wasn't part of our job. And my father said to me, you'll never succeed in life unless you really know how to take out another person's garbage. And that moment, Brian, was seared in my brain, and to this day, obviously. And I believe that what's lacking in our community, in society today, and I don't care what sector, it's the public sector, the private sector, whatever sector, we really have to get back into the thought process of taking out other people's garbage, looking after other people's mistakes, helping them finish off something that maybe wasn't your responsibility, but they needed help in. And I think that attitude about being a servant is really must come back if we're going to get ourselves out of this hole we're in.
So you talked about cooperation and collaboration, and you said that that cooperation and collaboration doesn't exist, you think, in politics or in society today to the extent that it did 20 years ago, and how we're divisive. Some people think that this is because of the impact of Donald Trump, think it's because of social media, because of media in general that becomes more echo chamber and polarized. We seem to be appealing to our bases rather than necessarily trying to create grow our own point of view and grow our society. What do you think the solution is to this challenge?
Well, Brian, you are a high performance, economically superior guy. You understand finance. You've had a background in finance. You know that Toronto is 20% of the GDP of this country. We are Toronto is the fifth largest economy in Canada. As Toronto goes, the whole country goes. Toronto right now is going through a very rough patch, not just the financial challenges of the city, okay, but the challenges related to immigration, because everybody wants to come to Toronto. People don't want to come to Bala. There's no housing or there are not enough jobs. Toronto is the center of the universe in Canada. And I believe that our national government right now does not fully get it, that as Toronto goes, the whole economy goes. And for our Minister of Finance 5 days ago to say to our newly elected mayor, Olivia Chow, that we're not stepping up, okay, go to the province, that's the wrong attitude. The government of Canada, just think of all the armories that the government of Canada has in Toronto. The Moss Park Armory, the Fort York Armory, the HMCS York, Downsview space. All of these spaces could be used immediately to deal with some of these challenges related to immigration, temporary, but there's no need for people to live on the streets in Toronto when we have these other resources. And these are Government of Canada resources. They're sitting there idle right now. So Toronto has to, the Government of Canada, in my mind, has to sit down with Mayor Chow and her council and say, okay, how can we work together? How can we get this done? And I just don't see that happening.
So the Liberal government can't get elected without some MPs getting elected from Toronto. And we have numerous, the vast majority of MPs in Toronto are Liberal MPs. Why do they have this attitude toward Toronto, do you think?
Well, you see, I don't think that this is a liberal conservative NDP issue. This is, you know, when somebody's drowning, okay, you don't say, well, let's go and have a meeting and figure out how to way to save them while they're drowning. You either jump in or you throw a rope or something to save them. You do it immediately. And I think that the lack of immediacy and the lack of selflessness is really causing, and it's causing an exacerbation on the problems that we have. And it goes back to my point, and this is the theme of the memoir that I'm working on, The Life of a Servant. I think people have to get back into the thought process. I'm here in this job to be a servant to my constituents, a servant to my people. And their need is now. It's not 6 months from now. Forget the election, Brian. Forget the election. Deal with these issues now. When we had SARS 20 years ago, in 10 weeks, we created a moment that got everybody rallying. Well, I say the same thing, same principle needs to be applied to the housing issue, to the encampment issue, to the refugee situation where the people are living on streets. And you will not convince me that we don't have the resources to fix this.
Okay, I understand what your argument is. The finance minister, who was also elected from Toronto, represents a Toronto riding, so really should have Toronto interests at her heart, effectively punted it to the province, saying this is a provincial responsibility. Did she not?
Yeah, she did, but that's the Government of Canada is the lead government in this country. It's not, and by the way, I'm not saying exclude the province in solving the problem. Everybody should be part of it. You know, there's nobody. It's not just it's not just one government. It's everyone. And get some of the creative people in the community, maybe even in that caucus. I talked to a caucus member last week about this idea of using the armories. And he says, you know, we never thought of that. Those resources are there. We should be thinking about how to use them.
Maybe we need you back in the caucus. So you know, why does this?
No, but now we've got a Minister of Defense for Canada, Bill Blair, who was a former police chief, of Toronto. So he knows the assets of the Government of Canada in Toronto. It should be a no-brainer for him. Lead, act.
Why don't we have it? What do you think? What's happened? You're arguing, I guess, that these government officials no longer think of themselves as servants and they're not cooperative. Like, why has this happened?
Well, you see, I don't blame any of this on Trump. Okay, I think that the vocation, being an elected member from your community, you're being elected, whether it doesn't matter what level, to serve. You are the servant.
Okay, Dennis, I understand. I understand what you think those elected representatives should have as their attitude, but you're arguing that they don't have that attitude today. And so my question is, why don't they have that attitude today? Why have they got a different attitude that's not as a servant that you would think it should be? What's happened? How has politics changed?
I don't know. I don't know the answer to your question. I don't know why it's not happening.
And so you say you don't
But-
blame it on Trump. Let me give you my argument for a second and consider it, please.
Okay.
I think that people's attitudes in elected office, maybe led by Donald Trump, but are more about themselves today. Donald Trump is there not for the benefit, I would argue, of the United States of America. He didn't hand over power through the transition like every other president in history of the United States has done. It was all about him keeping his job, and I think the Republican Party en masse today in the United States have a similar attitude. Otherwise, if they were thinking about the rule of law and about the right type of person that should be leading their party, they would be criticizing him and excluding him from the current campaign. And I think that attitude is very prevalent in elected officials, not everywhere, but a lot of places where they're there for themselves, not for us. And I think that this echo chambers that we live in, this media world that ends up being Fox on one side and CNN and MSNBC on the other side, is such that it's all about us and our own ideas, and there's less talking to the other side. I think that we cater to our base rather than trying to get out. And you and I remember walking up and down streets in Danforth with you when you were running. And when you would run into someone that had a different point of view, and I remember, I think it was an abortion issue or something like that I remember so distinctly, you would sit there on the porch or stand there on the porch and discuss with people and try to understand their point of view and explain your point of view. And I think today people just, are you going to vote liberal or conservative? And if they vote the other party, they just, okay, I'm going to mark you down as not bothering about you, and I'm going to go on to the next house.
Well, I'll pick up on your thoughts there. I would say that members of parliament today are marginalized. They don't seem to realize how much power they have. I was in a meeting 3 months ago with about 9 CEOs, and I went around the room and said, "Who's your MP?" 8 of the 9 couldn't name their MP. Then I said, okay, second exercise, who is your lobbyist? They all knew who their lobbyist was. Some of them had 2, some of them had 3 lobbyists, knew them all. And I think the culture of governing where the elected representative has been so marginalized, so denigrated, because the lobby culture has essentially dominated the force on how we are run as a country.
And you're saying, but the lobbyists just go to the PMO?
I'm not saying that they're going to the PMO. I'm certain some of them do, but I think it's, if depending on their sector, they'll target the people that are in their sector. If it's an oil and gas issue or a forestry issue, they don't go to their MP and say, look, here's our problem and we need you, or we want to come to your committee of industry or your committee of heritage, whatever. They tend to find out who the 7 or 8 key decision makers are, and they tend to be, a lot of them, unelected officials. Certainly they go to the minister and the minister's staff, but the member of parliament seems to no longer have the role that a member of parliament used to have 20 years ago or 30 years ago. When I was a member of parliament, there wasn't a day go by where we didn't have people knock on our door, whether it was from the motion picture sector or the environment sector, whatever it was. MPs were part of the process. And I see the role of the MP being really marginalized today.
I think you're right in that regard. And certainly some of the reports, I think it's called the Samara Group for Democracy, that have come out, and their reports would indicate that with the interviews that they've done of former MPs that are very negative in regards to the power, the influence, the role that they were playing in politics. And so the question, Dennis, obviously is, how do we change that?
I don't know. I mean, I said to Scott Aitchison, who's the member of parliament up here in Muskoka, he's a conservative. I talked to him 2 days ago. He's the housing critic. And I said, you've got a new guy in the cabinet. I said, my advice to you is don't criticize him. Call him up, congratulate him, and say you'd like to lock yourself in a room with him until you come up with a solution that you can both digest and work with and make happen. And Scott said, it's a great idea. I like it. I'm going to reach out to him. And I really think that we need more of that, especially in the environment we're in.
I agree with you. I just can't imagine Pierre Poilievre.
By the way,
Canadian do that.
Well, then Pierre Poilievre is not doing his job.
But he wants to win. So he actually wants Justin Trudeau and the current Minister of Housing to fail so that 2 years from now he can say, these guys have failed. He doesn't want to help them win. He's got to change his attitude. Pierre Poilievre will never win with an attitude of trying to embarrass the government. If he's got an idea, put it forward. But just to criticize for the sake of criticizing is not going to win. I guarantee it. We're chatting with Dennis Mills, a former member of parliament for 15 years, 16 years involved in politics for 20, businessman as well, and an incredibly smart, interesting, nice guy. We're going to take a break for some messages and be back in just 2 minutes with Dennis Mills for a little bit more on cooperation and collaboration and what's happened in our parliamentary system, in our governmental system, in our politics, such that it just doesn't exist, he thinks, anymore. And MPs aren't feeling like they're servants of the people. Stay with us, everyone. Back in 2. Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. My guest tonight is Dennis Mills. He's a 20-year experienced politician from Parliament Hill, 16 as a elected member of Parliament, the rest on Parliament Hill before that. And after that, he was a successful business person. He's up in ballot now, living the life and being very involved in local issues, though still staying very involved in Toronto issues, Greater Toronto issues, and issues of the country. Dennis, I got to ask you, because you're talking about is primarily interactions between parliamentarians and their constituents and their business issues in their area, and between different parties. But I think it's also between different governments too, as well. I just had a guest on who said that on housing issues, he felt like the different levels of government just weren't talking, and the provincial government was coming down hard on municipalities, and just sort of through ministerial zoning orders and other blanket statements and rules and regulations, implementing things without any kind of consultation or collaboration. And he said, in the end, we were trying to get to a better result, but you were creating a bunch of defensiveness in that regard. And he said the federal government is just as much in error in the ways that they're dealing with things, and that therefore he thought that the biggest problem in housing right now was that the three levels of government just weren't communicating, and too often were in opposition to one another. What do you think about that? Is that a problem as well?
I totally agree with that. That's consistent with the point I was making on the earlier part of the show, where I think that the three levels of government and the key representatives of that sector need to lock themselves into a situation, into a room with their officials, and they have to just stay in there until they come out with an idea that they're all together on. I mean, it's no different than the crisis that we have going with the ports in Western Canada right now. I mean, people should be locked in a room until these issues are solved. I mean, no, that situation in Western Canada is costing Canadians $1 billion a day. And I mean, you know, how can you just process that and not say, get in a room, stay in a room, and if we can't, well then fine, bring back the House of Commons and legislate them back to work. But for starters, you know, we can't continue to go in a situation where people are going, unless you're a fist on an issue, unless you're all together. That's why we did our thing 20 years ago with Molson's Canadian Rocks for Toronto. All three levels of government, police, everybody, we were a fist. We were all together. Nobody was looking for, oh, here's the Tory flag, here's the Liberal flag, here's the NDP flag. It was all for Canada. We were all one. We had NDP premiers, we had Conservative premiers, Ralph Klein, who was there, Ernie Eves. We all worked together. It can be done once you decide that the issue is so critical to the whole fabric of the company. It can be done, and that's what has to happen again.
So I come back to, so how do you change it? If you're talking about that, it's got to happen. I can see the difference, but it's not. And so, you know, one of the things, first problem, the first issue in solving a problem is realizing you've got it. Do you think people realize? Do you think parliamentarians, do you think government officials realize that we got this problem?
Well, listen, with your permission, first of all, I'm appreciative to being on your show, and you asked me my thoughts. This is the first time anybody's in a public way asked me about my thoughts on this issue in a long, long time. And with your permission, I'll take this show and I'll pass it on to some of the various people that I know at all three levels of government. And I'll say, look, we got to get back into the business of collaboration. We got to get back into the business of selflessness. And I think that we need more discussions like this to remind people what the essence of their vocation is when they're elected servants for the people of Canada.
I ended up having a really interesting conversation with a gentleman by the name of Joe Barrage. I'm not sure if you know that name. He's head of urban strategies, one of the top urban planners. And he was saying that, you know, he said, Brian, you know, the Greater Toronto Area is going to be the third largest metropolitan area in North America in the next couple of years, bigger than Chicago and Dallas and Houston, rivaling Los Angeles and New York. And he says, we don't realize that. We don't have that attitude toward it. And if we're going to be successful, we can't be separating out into a whole bunch of different fragmented entities. We got to be thinking about this vision of being the third largest metropolitan area in all of North America that goes from, you know, Oshawa to Hamilton, or even Kitchener and farther afield. And we've got to run ourselves with that kind of vision and that kind of orientation to harness that opportunity and make it a success. And he said, we're just not doing it. We're all fragmented into, you know, the Toronto and all the suburbs around it that don't get together, don't coordinate. And if anything, we're going to become more fragmented rather than more unified. What do you think of that?
Well, that's what I've tried. That's what I've been saying in the last half hour here on this show. There's no collaboration. The way we had our success 20 years ago was collaboration and selflessness. Joe's saying exactly the same thing. I totally agree with him.
How do we solve it? How do we solve it? Do we need Dennis Mills back in Parliament?
No. I think, quite frankly, the media is not doing a very good job. I think that the Star and the Globe need to pump up this idea of collaboration. You know, I mean, they tend to sort of focus that the essence of their business is to write stories that are gotcha stories or putting down stories or total criticism stories. There's got to be a collaborative message. Look, again, I go back to this example 20 years ago. I remember once Gary Slate, who I just adore, said, we'd like to have the exclusive on doing the SARS or, you know, the event up at Downsview. I said, Gary, we can't have an exclusive. I said, we need everybody involved. There's no exclusive for anybody. And God bless Gary, he totally cooperated and got on board, used the entire CFRB system. But every station, every network, like that's what we need right now, Brian. Joe Barrett is right. It's all hands on deck.
Let me ask you about a couple of other issues. I interviewed a current MP who went to Africa for a conference and justified that it was critically important to attend that conference in person because that was the way you got collaboration and communication and understood, the lived realities of people from around the world. But then this person was also supportive of Parliament voting to continue hybrid and not having to meet everyone in person. And that you could interact through Zoom rather than necessarily have to meet in person. I tried to argue that if you're going to have collaboration, if you're going to have a really good debate, if you're going to have question period that has actually a constructive question period where you make the questions and you got to answer, you need to be in a room together. And that's what company after company have found, that the critical meetings have to be in person. You can have other things hybrid, but the critical meetings for collaboration have to be in person. What do you think about Parliament continuing in a hybrid scenario?
I think it's awful. I wish I could be stronger. I'm telling you right now that chamber, the House of Commons, is the nation's boardroom. When I was first elected to the Parliament of Canada, I was in opposition. And we had many, many hours there that went till 12 o'clock, 1 o'clock, 2 o'clock in the morning, waiting for votes. But the interaction, even though we had, Brian Mulroney was the Prime Minister, he had a very aggressive position that members of Parliament should talk to one another. And I remember one night walking across the floor, speaking to the then Conservative Minister of Immigration, said I had a very important file that I was really having a difficult time getting through the bureaucracy. And I'd been working on it for many, many months. And the minister said to me, Dennis, consider it done. Consider it done. That relationship that you can build by being in the same room and walking across the floor, you can't do it in a hybrid format. Okay, that chamber is sacred. That chamber is all about running the country, and worked under Mulroney, that worked with Turner. Any prime minister that I've worked for 5 prime ministers, and when I say work for them, even if they were, I'm a liberal and I've worked for conservative prime ministers, because I felt that chamber was the whole country's. So no hybrid formula for me. Into the House and long hours. And I'd also say I'd make it mandatory that CPAC cover that chamber constantly, 24/7. It bugs me when I go on CPAC and I see the Supreme Court hearings, and yet there's nothing. I can't see what's being debated in the House of Commons. And if there's and maybe from time to time CPAC will go to a committee, but the elected members of our country, Brian, are where it's at. And the chamber, the House of Commons, and the committees, that's where all the action is. And that activity should permeate the presence of CPAC, and it should be there for all Canadians to sort of turn on anytime they want.
Well, and they hate this rule that they are not allowed to show the empty seats. They're only allowed to show the people that are there. The people should see how many empty seats there are and the people aren't there. Let me ask you about a different issue, Dennis, if I could. I've had the privilege, not 1/10 or 1/100th that you have, but I've been out knocking on doors, and you've been knocking on doors for probably most of your adult life. You've probably been knocking on doors, campaigning and meeting people. I find that in the past, because turnout was higher, there was a lot more persuasion attempted at doors. And I fear that today, because turnout's gone down, all you do is identify. All you want to know is, are they a Liberal voter or an NDP voter or a Green voter or a Conservative voter? And then they're going to turn around on election day and make sure they get out and vote. So it's identify and get out the vote, rather than any attempt at actually persuading someone that your idea or your candidate is right, and the person that's deserving of the vote. And I worry that this is because turnout has gone down, and so therefore there's less people that are sort of undecided in the middle, that you want to try to swing one way or the other. What do you think about that? Does that have any credence with you as well?
In our very first campaign in 1988, somebody came up to me and said, Dennis, there's a section of this riding that we call the black hole. In the past 20 years, 80% of the people in that area voted NDP. So we would advise you to not spend any time in that area, because there's no way you could make a change with those people. They're hard rock NDP. And I said, well, let me tell you what we're going to do. We're going to go into the black hole every day. We're going to go into the black hole every day. And we did go into the black hole every day. And we talked to people that were passionate in their NDP position on many things. But in the end, okay, we got about 10% of that vote. And that 10% was the reason why we won in 88. So this idea of not working to get the vote, or just sort of only go in that corner because that's where the Liberals hang out, or this corner where the Conservatives hang out, it's crazy. I don't buy it at all. You talk to everyone.
I interviewed a parliamentarian from Australia, and as you undoubtedly know, Australia has mandatory voting. Not everyone votes, but they have mandatory voting. So the vast majority of people actually turn out. And they said that the biggest difference was that because you knew everyone was going out, you didn't do the identify and get out the vote. What you did is persuade. You needed to go to every door and try to persuade because everyone was there. And he said the biggest, most positive change to ensure that democracy survived was going to mandatory voting. What do you think of that?
I love the Australian system, and they actually give you a fine if you don't vote, and I would totally support that position. But so I'm all in for that. I mentioned that a couple of times on radio shows in the past, and people thought I was out of my mind. How dare you? But I mean, you speed limit. You go over the speed limit, you get a fine. Well, I mean, nothing's more important than your vote. Okay, and to just, when we're getting voter turnouts of 17, 18%, I mean, that to me is negligence. But this whole idea in Australia of persuasion, that's the fun of the job. I can remember walking down streets with canvassers, and there'd be an NDP sign on somebody's lawn. And I'd say, okay, let's go. You'd walk upstairs, knock on the door, and the person would come to the door and say, didn't you see the sign on the front lawn? What are you doing here? And I'd said, well, yeah, but there's 6 people here in this house on our list. Yeah? Well, do you all think and act the same way? Is it a possibility that one of the 6 might be a Liberal? In other words, it goes to your point about persuasion. I mean, yeah, and it was fun. We enjoyed it.
I remember walking those streets with you, Dennis, and it was fun. We're going to take a break for some messages and be back with some concluding comments with Dennis Mills in just 2 minutes. Stay with us, everybody. This is fun. Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. I'm having a really fun time chatting tonight with Dennis Mills. I got to tell you that I had the pleasure of going campaigning with Dennis Mills in the past. I've had the pleasure of walking into his office in Parliament Hill and asking him to help me out on an issue. And he was, along with a few other people, Scott Bryson was another one. And at the time he was a Conservative, and you were a Liberal. And so it was interesting that the two of you were the most helpful to me, and not doing exactly what I wanted, but listening to me and taking action on the issue. And so Mr. Mills, thank you so much for that and the service that you provided to the people of Canada in that regard. If you got to sit down today with Justin Trudeau, with Pierre Poilievre, with Olivia Chow, with our premier, what would you tell them?
Well, I would start off by saying to Justin Trudeau, because I am a liberal and I would reach out there, and I'd say it to anybody, but I'd say, Justin, you need to come to Toronto, book yourself into the Royal York Hotel for about 2 weeks, and you go and sit in Olivia Chow's office every day for 2 weeks and bend over backwards to help her get through the challenges that she's facing. Because as Toronto goes, Justin, you go.
And Pierre Poilievre?
That was my message.
What would you say?
I'd say the same thing. I'd say the same thing.
Doug Ford?
Same thing. Absolutely.
Okay. So
all three of them.
What would you say if you sat down with Olivia Chow? Should she invite them? Should she welcome them? Or should she try to do it all on her own?
No, the Prime Minister should take the lead. The Prime Minister should take the lead. He should pick up the phone and say, I want to help you, Olivia. I want to come down there. I want to sit down with you and let's get through this. Because we need Toronto healthy in every way.
Dennis, are you optimistic about Toronto or pessimistic right now?
I'm by nature an optimistic person, as you know. And
never better, never better.
Never better. That's it. And, I told Bob Hepburn the other day from the Toronto Star, I said, if Olivia Chow reached out to me and asked me to do something that would help the city, I'd do it in a heartbeat. I think that right now, the person that needs the most help in our country is Olivia Chow. And I think we should all rally around her.
Dennis Mills, former member of parliament, former business executive, really nice, intelligent and smart and nice guy. Thank you so much for joining us today. Really appreciate it.
Oh, it's a pleasure, Brian. I love your show. Thank you for inviting me.
That's our show for tonight, everybody. Thank you for joining us. I remind you, I'm on at 6 o'clock every night at 9:60 a.m. You can stream me online, even from Bala, Ontario, if your internet is working, at www.saga960am.ca. All my podcasts and videos are available on my website, briancrombie.com. And I post all of my videos on Facebook, Instagram, LinkedIn, and YouTube. And all my podcasts are available anywhere good podcasts are: Audible, Apple, Speakeasy, and SoundCloud. Thanks for joining us. Dennis, it's been a pleasure seeing you, sir.
Always good to see you, Brian.
Never
Enjoyed
better.
the show.
Never better.
Never better.